This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
I was at my house. It was New Year's Eve. I got a call that they wanted me to go to North Phoenix.
Like everyone else that night, Joe Brownlee was getting ready to leave 1980 behind and ring in 1981 in Phoenix.
It was New Year's Eve. They were having a New Year's Eve party.
It was a night of celebration at the Redmond family home.
There was cooking going on in the kitchen, everything set up for a party.
Pat and Marilyn Redmond were excitedly getting ready for guests that night. Joe Brownlee, unexpectedly, one of them. There was a knock at the door. Marilyn went to go get the partygoers.
She said she had answered the door that leads into the garage. She thought it was somebody coming for the party, maybe early. And she opened the door, identified himself as a police officer, said, "I'd like to come in." And she said, "Okay, come on in."
Marilyn wasn't expecting a police officer at the party. Behind him were two other men who she didn't know. Turns out, they weren't there for the party.
They asked who else was there, and she said, "Well, my husband and my mother. Where are they?" So they herded all three of them to the master bedroom, and they tied up Mr. Redmond and Mrs. Phelps and gagged them with socks in their mouth. And then they asked Mrs. Redmond a series of questions.
Hours later is when Joe gets a call to get to the Redmond house.
"We've got a very unusual, difficult homicide. We need Joseph Brownlee, Joseph Brownlee. I was in the Major Felony Bureau at the County Attorney's Office, handling murders and other serious felonies.
Joe Brownlee was a young prosecuting attorney in Phoenix back in the 80s. When he got the call to head to a homicide at the Redmond family home that night, he had no idea what he was walking into, a case he'd still be involved in almost 40 years later. Nowadays, we don't normally see attorneys at a crime scene. Things were different back then.
I was there essentially within the hour or so after the Phoenix Police Department homicide unit showed up.
Joe walked into the home. The living room, the kitchen, everything seemed normal. And then he opened the door to the bedroom to a gruesome scene.
The crimes occurred in the master bedroom. Patrick Redmond was bound and had a sock in his mouth, and his throat had been slit ear to ear, most likely post-mortem. In other words, the 2 shots to the head killed him. His mother-in-law, Helen Phelps, was also restrained, her arms tied behind her back, a sock in her mouth, 2 shots to the back of the head. So both of those bodies were shot execution style.
There were 3 victims, though. Marilyn Redmond had been shot too, but was somehow still alive.
And when she regained consciousness, she got off the bed and started crawling toward the front door because she knew that people were going to come to the party and they would find her.
She was rushed to the hospital.
We had no idea if she was going to survive or not. We could tell very quickly that this was a hit.
There were so many questions. Who were these 3 men who carried out the murders? Why was this so meticulously planned out and heinous? And what was their connection to the Redmond family? From what investigators could gather from friends and family, the Redmonds were a pretty normal, well-liked family. No enemies stuck out. In fact, nothing bad stuck out. Pat and his wife Marilyn were happily married. Pat was a businessman. He ran a printing business on the west side of town called Graphic Dimensions with his partner Ron Lukazik, and they were successful. But it seemed Pat was at the center of this execution-style hit.
Why was Pat Redmond targeted?
That took a while to figure out.
Answers that were seemingly hidden beyond much more corruption were 1,800 miles away from Phoenix, and about to be brought to light.
My name is Greg Owen, Greggowen.
At the time, Greg Owen was appointed as the head of gang prosecutions in Chicago. He was young, but fiery.
Aggressive, a little bit flamboyant, and not traditional.
Those are the words he used to describe himself in 1980. His role in this saga of a case began about 2 months before the New Year's Eve killings in Phoenix, with another set of holiday killings in Chicago.
A particular Sunday, I got a call in January, I believe, that they had 2 gang members that they thought were responsible for a triple murder that had happened just before Thanksgiving in Chicago.
Sadly, crimes like this weren't all too uncommon in Chicago, but there was one street gang in particular that kept making headlines.
It was more than a gang, it was a murder-for-hire organization called the Royal Family.
Was the Royal Family behind the Thanksgiving murders in Chicago? The answer was yes. 2 of the men involved were found, Murray Hooper and Morris Nellam.
And they found Hooper. He was hiding in a building somewhere in Chicago, and they found this guy, Morris Nellam. They were together.
Greg was trying to fully solve the Thanksgiving murders and who all was involved, and made a plea agreement with Morris Nellam. Greg helped Nellam's family stay safe in witness protection for an exchange of information. Murray Hooper, William Bracey, Roger Lee Cochise Collins. They're identified as the Thanksgiving killers. What Greg didn't expect was Morris Nellam would come forward with more information about a different crime.
He actually called me and said, I have some more stuff to tell you about another murder.
In a completely different part of the country.
He's telling me all about this murder in Phoenix, which I knew nothing about a murder on New Year's Eve and how he had picked them up at the airport.
He had picked up Murray Hooper and William Bracey, who had just flown back to Chicago from Phoenix. The 2 started arguing in the car.
What they said was, you MF, he said to him, I can't believe you're so stupid. You only shot her one time. I said, I need more bullets. Why didn't you say something? He says, well, man, this guy's telling me the story. He's actually relating the conversation. He's hearing about how the woman survived.
That was Marilyn Redmond, Pat Redmond's wife.
He's reciting this all to me, and I go, really? So I get on the phone, I call Maricopa County DA, and they get all freaked out. They go, I think some of our people are there in Chicago right now. I go, you're kidding me? I had no knowledge. All of a sudden, I think that day or that evening, I meet Joe Brownlee, and I'm a couple of investigators who happened to be in Chicago, literally when these guys were arrested.
Marilyn was shot point blank in the head. And not only did Marilyn survive, but her memory was intact.
Where does the bullet enter her head to where she not only survives, but can function after that?
It was a fluke. And Murray was out of bullets. So he couldn't shoot her a second time like he did the other 2. Let's just say he was satisfied with his work. And the deed is done. She's unconscious, but he thinks she's dead too. And before leaving, Murray had a big butcher knife with him, and he slit Mr. Redmond's throat essentially from ear to ear.
Remember, these guys walked her around the house looking for guns, money, and jewelry before they committed the murders.
Which allowed her to look at them very carefully, which becomes very important.
In a photo lineup, she's able to identify Murray Hooper and William Bracey as 2 of the killers inside her home that night, without any doubt. Now, Joe and Greg know they have to arrange extra protection to make sure Marilyn stayed safe.
As far as the royal family is concerned, she's a loose end, because these guys made no attempt to conceal who they were. No mask, no nothing.
The Arizona New Year's Eve murder investigation now becomes intertwined with the Chicago Thanksgiving murder investigation, with the same people involved. The question is, why? Why did Chicago gang members get tied up in a Phoenix assassination? That's That's when a Phoenix informant also emerges. A woman, the hitmen, Murray Hooper and William Bracey, were staying within Phoenix while they were here, the two simultaneously running a drug ring. She confirmed they were involved in the execution-style hit that New Year's Eve night and fills in some more gaps of how they did it and who they did it with. We knew there was one more person with them that carried out the crime. She gives authorities that name, remembering his car was used as the getaway car before they came back to her place. This is the guy who dressed as a cop, but he wasn't just dressed as that. That was actually a past reality.
The third killer was a gentleman who had been a police officer. That was Ed McCall.
At the Phoenix Police Department.
At the Phoenix Police Department.
The woman tells police they bought plastic gloves at the drugstore to use during the murders, which is why there were no fingerprints. They find that drugstore receipt inside Ed McCall's car.
At first, are you trying to figure out how these two people from Chicago and this former Phoenix cop even get together in the first place?
Of course.
And what'd you find?
Well, we found that there was a fellow locally that was Robert Cruz, went by Bobby Cruz.
Who is Robert Cruz? That was another name these Phoenix and Chicago attorneys had never heard before. Joe Brownlee starts to research him.
He actually had a small business called Mel's Italian Ice, where he served essentially snow cones near Arizona State University.
So he was an Arizona businessman, but that couldn't possibly be the reason he became part of the story. And it wasn't. He was doing business elsewhere, too.
So now we have Robert Cruz. We have these two people identified by these women.
From Chicago.
Murray Hooper, William Bracey.
Yes.
And Edward McCall.
And
how does Robert, who owns the snow cone business, play into these three people that allegedly went to the Redmond house that night?
He was the one who made the call. Robert Cruz made the call to Chicago to get the two killers, Billy Bracey and Murray Hooper, to come to Phoenix. He was connected to organized crime in Chicago.
The Mafia.
What do you mean? A murder in Phoenix and some people involved and somebody's related to the Mafia? I didn't even know what he was talking about. It sounded far-fetched, but it wasn't far-fetched at all. It was right on.
I didn't expect this investigation to lead us to the mob, but once we started peeling more and more layers back, it was clear everything about this case led to more corruption that trickled all the way up to even the highest-ranking government officials. Chicago may have been where everything started in this case, and Phoenix is where it ended. But something happened in the middle, connecting it all together.
What did Pat Redmond have to do with these three men?
Well, come to find out that Bobby Cruz had a contact in Las Vegas at one of the casinos.
Sin City. That's what changes everything.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
So we needed to learn about the inner workings of the Mafia.
And I became a more or less a professional hitman.
And while he wasn't involved in this case specifically,
The fear of death rules. You break those rules, you die. That's the only thing that controls it.
who better to explain how Mafia connections could trickle down from New York to Chicago to Las Vegas to Phoenix
Well, my 19 murders, 18 of them died.
than the former underboss of the Gambino family and one of the most prolific and infamous Mafia hitmen to ever live.
And my name is Salvatore Gravano, but I'm probably better known as Sammy the Bull. Money, connections, power, and greed. All of those things control everything, all the time.
That's next time on part 2 of The Last Hitman. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney, and produced by Sergio Hernandez. It's a production of Arizona's Family, 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.